So these are the images, source, alt source already on there. For the sake of the video, there it is. And there they are. Okay. Yep, so let's add the jQuery library. So again, it's the same file directory, so we'll put jquery.js. Refresh, let's click on the network tab and see if it's actually loading the jQuery library. And index file is loaded, styles.css is loaded, jQuery.js is loaded, and there it is. So we know it's working. Cool, so right after that script tag, let's add another script tag. And what now? Yeah, why? Why do we need document.ready?
We wanted to read the whole document, all the HTML before it actually.
Exactly. Exactly. And for what it's worth, it's going to wait until it puts all the HTML on the browser, but it's not going to wait until all the images are loaded. So if these images are loaded very slowly, it's still going to fire off as soon as the DOM just has all the content. So there's two different things you can consider. .ready and .load, I think, is the other one that waits for things to load. So okay. Now what? We want some kind of event handler, right? We want some kind of action in this case. We want it so when we, is it when we click or hover? Which one is this? It's hover. So when we hover any one of these images, we want it to essentially show us the alternate image. Is it hover on this one? It's click, yeah. So it just switches. Hover, that's for the,
It's for the optional.
yes. But it'll be the same effect. Yeah. So let's do the click here. What are we clicking on? We're going to click on images, any image, right? Not a specific image. Otherwise, we have to recopy paste this for all the images. So if any image is clicked on, then run this block of code. That's essentially what we're saying so far. That's it. That's all that's saying. We don't know if that's working yet, so we're going to put an alert, image clicked, and let me double check. I'm pretty sure this returns also an event, so we can see that. Maybe we'll alert image clicked, and then we'll console log the event. I'll explain that in just a second. I just want to make sure that that click does that. It does that. So if I click on it, we get the alert, the first part of my code, and the second part is this event object that's being returned. This is like built in. It's built into the click function, so that when we execute this function here and we grab all the images, then we execute the click function off of that object, and we execute now a callback. Callback meaning something else calls on this when it's ready, right? The first parameter given to us by the callback in this function is going to be the event. You can call it whatever you want. I called it E, but you can call it event. You can call it whatever your heart desires. But it just goes by order, right? It's just like us calling a function. It's the same thing, but it's being paid. We're being passed in the event of the element. So, and this is the event. It talks about what it is, if it was clicked, its current position, all sorts of things. So we don't really need it, but just be aware that it's there. If you need the event, later on we use it. So we know the image selection is working. We know we can click on the images and that works. So now what?
We need to change the location.
Exactly. We need to do the swap, right? So if we look at the whiteboard there, we can see there that we're setting temp to the image of attribute source. We're talking about attributes here. We want to get the value of an attribute. So we could just Google this. So this is jQuery attribute. Get the attribute value. There's a function coming up immediately. If we look at this, we already know what this is, but I wanted to see if we can just look at this. So attribute, attribute name. Get the value of an attribute of the first element in the set of matched elements. The first element of the set of matched elements. So if I get like 5 things, it'll always grab me the first one it finds that matches the name, right? So usually here they give you a pretty straightforward example. Let's see if we can find it real quick. There it is. But let's just actually write it out. So it's $ and the image, any particular image or the first image it finds. Let's talk a little bit about what do we need to put here as opposed to the image tag.
This.
Why this? What's it doing? What's this doing?
This is referring to the specific image. If you do image, it'll replace everything.
Yep, awesome. So if this if this selector was anything, as a matter of fact, if it was something like that, whoops, then this is if any element is clicked on, execute this block of code, and this is going to give me anything that I click on. It doesn't matter what it is, right? But we're limiting and saying if the image of any image gets clicked on, then this is going to give me that particular image. It could give me anything, but it's only going to trigger if an image is clicked on, right? So that's the way you can kind of like specify that I want any image to be clicked on. Cool. So let's make sure this is working. Console log this. Refresh. There's the image. That's the one I clicked on. Let's click on the one down here. There's the one I clicked on. It's working. Awesome. So now let's grab that particular one's attribute. So this particular image dot attr like it shows us, and then the attribute name, which is source src. And let's console log this thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to see it. Let me space it out a little bit so it shows a little better. So we're going to take this value. This value is going to be returned to where I'm highlighted. So we're going to console log the result. Let's refresh. Click on that. We get the cat 0, cat 1, 2, 3, etc. Right? Cool. So we know that represents the source. Now let's do the same thing to grab the value for the alt source. Same exact thing, but here we're going to put alt-source. See if that grabs us the alt source. Cat 0, ninja 0, so it's grabbing at the alt source. So now we know how we can grab any properties. As a matter of fact, if I just put x here, 5, and we do the same thing, it should work, unless it just doesn't for some reason. There's a 5, right? So anything I can call on and grab its value. Or I can grab of anything and change its value, right? And that's by just adding another comma here and putting whatever I want to change that value, not the tag source, but the value of that source tag, which is kind of a thing that might be a little confusing. So let's back up for a minute. We know we can call on these tags. That's great. Now let's do the change. We're going to call on, so we talked about it over there, right? If we're going to override one of the two, before we override something, we have to save it as a temporary variable. So we'll put here temp is equal to this dot attribute of source. So we're going to take the source attribute, store into temp. And here, let's console log temp. I'm going a little slow here because I want to show the step-by-step process. Well, there's temp right there. Cool. So we know this is temp. We know that this value of source has been saved. That means I can override it and not worry about it because I have it in temp. So then we're going to override this with whatever this is, right? So we're going to take this, copy it, and then we're going to put a comma here and add whatever we want to paste into it. I can create a variable and paste a variable there. I can put a string and just make something up. Or we can just take this, which we know that represents the string of the alt source, and place it right here. Questions? Cool. So let's see what it looks like now. Let's refresh. Let's click on it. Let's inspect the element, and now they both have ninja 0 on alt source and source because I took the source and overrid the, I took the alt source and overrid the source with it. So if I didn't put it in temp, I would have lost that completely. So since we have it in temp and that's done with, now we can take temp and override the alt source with it. So it's like the inverse of what we just did here. As opposed to redefining the alt source, we're going to redefine the alt source to be temp. So it's 3 steps. It's let's set temp, override source, and then override all source with temp. Let's refresh, click, and now it did it. Now they changed, so if I click it again, it just takes the source, puts it in temp, takes the alt source, puts it in source, and just does a swap. So it doesn't matter how many times I click on this, you should just keep swapping between the two. There you are. Questions? Shoot.
When I kind of brute force this, and I just changed the classes.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first did it, I had a problem with it not reading. Like I said, hey, if it's this, you click on something that happens to be Ninja 1 class, then make it a Cat 1 class, and I figured out the Cat 1 class, make it a Ninja class.
So you changed the classes too.
I thought, yeah, but it didn't work. It wouldn't go back and forth, and I think it's because it wouldn't reread You know what I'm saying?
I do. Did you use remove class and add class as functions for adding and removing classes?
No.
That may be something you'd want to do, as opposed to using the attribute source for the class. You use attribute source for class, right?
Yeah, attribute class. No, just attribute class.
I see. Attribute class. I'm not sure.
I mean,
Not-
I got its work.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, that's good.
But I just.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I mean, maybe is there a way to like read the document?
I see. Well, it should always be, but okay. So, are we talking about the click event, or are we talking about the attribute source?
At the end of it, if it says go from Ninja 1 to Ninja 2,
Uh-huh.
then read documents, I guess, is something like that possible?
So, did you modify the DOM? Essentially, did you like change out the tag for a different tag?
Yeah.
If you added a tag, there is a difference. If you is that what you did?
I think that's what I did. I
Okay.
changed it to where it's as a function of the statement now, so it's not.
Okay.
It's not
Okay.
the same. Yeah.
Let me cover one thing that you guys can use this from here on forward, but you should know why we're using it, right? So we have here an image click event that is going to click on anything that is an image. But the click event on the image tag is taking into account what the DOM looks like when the DOM was done loading. Meaning, once this was done loading, this is the snapshot we have. So once we get to line 9, it looks at this snapshot and affects only these elements. But suppose in here somewhere we have we call on, let's say, the body tag, and we append, and what we append into it is another one of these. Watch it work. That'll be crazy. One second. Should work. So I'm adding another image to the end of the body tag, right? So if I click on one of these, I should have an extra image down there. If I click on another one again, more images, right? So any of these things that I click on, it adds another image. But if I click on these, it's not adding any images. And that's because the click event only knows the 5 we have here. It doesn't know the 6th, 7th, and 8th that I added, because on document.ready, it takes a snapshot of the DOM as it is right in that moment. So every time you do a click event, it only knows those and only has event handlers on those. Right? So a way to avoid that, and it might be parallel to what you're saying, so
Yeah,
yeah,
I guess
excuse me for
it's-
that, is we change the click event to look at the current DOM as is before putting the handler on it, the event handlers. Meaning, as opposed to doing this right here, we'll redefine it and say, call on the document as it currently sits in the moment, and then on click of the image tag, run a function. So this thing here is the exact same thing as we have here. It's written differently because this is not calling on the image that was as it was when it first got done loading. It's calling on the image as the current document is right now. That's the difference. So in theory, you could just use this forever and be fine, and there'd be no problem. Unless you wanted the opposite action, you wanted the opposite activity, where if you click on something that was already there, you want it to affect, but if something is being added, you don't want it to be affected, right? You choose between these two. Not likely that would happen, but I suppose you would. But my point being is, if you do write this code, you should know that this is the difference between the two. Is the top one will affect the DOM currently as is, so any dynamic elements added after the fact, it will still be affected. They will still be affected. Versus here, only the elements that were defined in the body when it was done loading will be affected. And anything add on top of it doesn't have the event handler on it. So I'm not sure if that's what Bob was doing, but in case you were adding other elements or removing elements and putting new elements in there, they will no longer have that event handler on them. Yeah.
So you're supposed to use a document.on right after document.ready?
Good question. So two different things. Document.ready is just like when a DOM is done loading, do this. But since we are already calling on the document, we don't need to put those nested within that. We could put it here. The difference is that if your document, if the DOM is loading and the first thing on the very top of the page is an image that has a document.on click, if you click on that thing, it will execute that command no matter if the other rest of it is done loading or not. Which can be good and bad, because if you click on that thing but it's trying to affect something that has not been loaded in the bottom of the DOM, it's not going to trigger anything. Make sense? So be aware of that one. I'll leave it up there. And just be aware that this is the more traditional way. Not traditional, it just depends on what you're doing, honestly. That's really what it is. But notice how I alerted and console logged every part of it. Highly recommend you guys all do that. It's just, over time, it'll make a lot of sense and you'll avoid all that, but in the meantime, I think it's well worth it. Okay, let me touch on one more point while we're on this. And as far as the callback goes, I want to touch on this as much as possible because it's just one of those things that takes the time to understand. What is that thing exactly? What is a callback, as I call it, the fancy word for it?
Promise.
Okay, sure, that's true.
No, that's not really fancy though.
It's fancier than saying callback, I guess. Yeah, it's newer, I guess, or something.
It's a list of tasks to complete.
Right, right. It's like a it's like this. This whole thing is essentially the same thing as creating a function called ABC, invoking the ABC function, and in the ABC function passing it three things: passing it A, passing it B, and passing it C. And this ABC function is going to take ABC and do something with them, right? I don't know, add them together or something, right? That function ABC is this function over here called ABC that does something in the code, right? Now, if I put return something in ABC, then this whole thing gets returned and replaced with something else, right? But I'm not going to return. I'm going to expect ABC with the parameters of first, second, and third. I changed the name so it's not like ABC, right? So if I console log here first, second, and third, I get the string of A, B, and C, right? What if I pass? So let me actually show that because I think that'll make a lot of sense. Okay, let's comment that out also. So there's A, B, and C, right? What if I pass in a number? Would that still work? It would? Sure. What if I pass in an array? Would that still work? Whoops. What did I screw up on? Oh, one extra bracket there, parenthesis. Sure. I could pass in a number. I could pass a string. I could pass an array. What if I pass in an object? Would that still work? Can I pass in an object as a parameter as opposed to a number or a string? Yep. I can pass in an object that has a bunch of stuff in it. I can pass in an object that has a key with a value of another object, right? You can pass in whatever you want. So if I can pass all of this stuff into it, let's go back to A, 1, 2, 3, and C, right? Could I also pass in a function? So let's create a function up here called test, or every time I do that, I don't get it. That console logs test. Testing, all right, that works. This is defined as the word test. So after I define the function, if I just simply console log the word test, I should get this. Oops, what did I do? Oh, I'm missing something there. Okay, sorry about that. See that? I defined a function called test that has some code inside of it, instructions, right? It's called test, and then I'm just console logging test, so I'm getting the entire function block of code back, right? Now, if I invoke test, meaning if I run the function, it's going to give me the word testing, and it gives me undefined. It gives me undefined because this whole thing resulted into undefined because that function never returned anything. And since it didn't return anything, this became undefined, and then it tried to console log undefined. Make sense? Cool. So we know that test with parentheses invokes a function, and we know test by itself does not invoke the function, it's just a function itself. So if this is the same thing as any variable, could I just pass in here test?
And return what the function is.
Right. Because if I pass in the string A, I pass in the string 1, 2, 3, and I pass in a function called test, I get A, 1, 2, 3, and a function called test, right? Now this is a named function, right? I called it test, but I can also pass in an anonymous function, which is a fancy word of saying I'm going to pass in this whole function without our name right here. and I'm not going to name it. Same thing. That's all it is. When we say something is a callback, we're just pretty much saying that we are going to execute a function called, in this case, ABC. And ABC is going to pass in first, second, and third. And now the third is a function. I haven't invoked that function yet, but it is a function, right? And that's why it's console logging A, 1, 2, 3, and function. You ready with me? Kind of? So what do I do to invoke the function? What do I do to call a function? Yeah, parentheses. That wasn't a trick question, sorry. So just a parenthesis. So all we did is we defined a function. We don't need that anymore. We created a function called function ABC that expects first, second, and third parameter. We created we called on the function, and actually let me show you what it looks like a little more inline, because that'll make a little more sense. There it is. We called a function called ABC. We passed it a string of A, 1, 2, 3, and a function block. That was returned A here, 1, 2, 3 here, and a function block right there. And down over here somewhere, we invoke that function block. When we invoke that function block, that's when this triggers. That's exactly what's happening on the click event and on the ready event. We execute a function called click, but the first parameter was a function itself, was a callback function. So it's the difference of just doing this. Let's invoke ABC, and the first parameter I'm going to pass into ABC is a function. So when and if ABC calls the first parameter as an function, it's going to invoke it. Where are we? Like 0 to 10. Are we negative numbers? Or are we?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's not bad. Again, you don't have to really worry too much about it. We're going to do APIs that touch on this idea, but I'm just trying to show the simple kind of approach to it. That's all it is. In JavaScript, which is I think the unique language out of most, the fact that the parameter you can pass into a parameter, like in this case, a function, is quite unique. Or passing into it a function. Yeah.
So is a recursion a type of callback? Because yesterday they were talking about like how people solve the algorithms of recursion.
Recursion is not quite the callback, because recursion is calling its own function. It's not passing into it a function. If it was recursing and passing into it another function, that would be kind of like maybe two things in one. But two different things. Recursion just means that I have the function called ABC, irrelevant of these two, and I'm going to call ABC inside of it. I'm not going to run this because it's going to run forever, and it's going to crash my browser. Callback is when we pass into ABC a function, and then the function of ABC at some point calls that function. So it's like you're calling a function, and then when the function is done, it calls you back, allowing you to do whatever you want here. So this set of instructions could be, whoops. Well, when the callback is done and calls me back, I know whatever job it was doing is done, so I can do a bunch of other code. All right, not bad.